Around noon on Saturday, April 24th, 2010, a 64-year-old sales clerk named Kathy Goebel grabbed a suit jacket off the rack at a high-end men's store in Charleston, West Virginia. She carried it over to a customer, and then she helped him put it on in front of the mirror. And after he was dressed, the man smiled at his reflection and said it looked great. So Kathy had worked at the store now for 10 years, and she really loved working there. I mean, everything about it was great. The staff was like family, she herself was very people-oriented and was great at building relationships with customers. In fact, she was so good at, building relationships that men from all over town would come to the store specifically to see Kathy when they needed a new suit. However, this man she was currently helping wasn't like all the other customers. His name was Dr. Harry King, and he was a radiologist, and he had been a regular at the store for many years. And even though he was married, and even though Kathy herself was in a long-term relationship, these two were actually having an affair. Harry had a lot of money, and he really enjoyed showering Kathy with expensive gifts. In fact, he had even paid to have her kitchen redone. And just a couple of weeks ago, he'd taken her on a trip across the country to San Francisco. Now, when Kathy went on that trip, she had told her longtime boyfriend, Fred Farrell, that it was actually just a girls' trip to visit an old friend. And even though she did feel bad about lying to him, Kathy really didn't know how long her relationship with Fred was going to last anyway, so it sort of seemed like maybe it's not worth trying to protect it. Kathy and Fred had been dating for about 2 years, and Fred was definitely a nice guy, but recently he had asked Kathy to marry him, and she definitely was not sure about that and told him, I don't know, I have to think about it. So the big reason why Kathy was definitely on the fence about marriage in general was actually because Kathy had been divorced twice already. She also liked having her own house and her own life and not being tied to just one man. But she couldn't bring herself to actually break up with Fred when he proposed, and so she was sort of in this holding period now. And she figured that, as long as her affair with Harry stayed a secret, nobody would get hurt. So Kathy carried Harry's new suit over to the cash register, and as she rang it up, Harry leaned over the counter and asked if she wanted to go grab lunch. And Kathy smiled and said, sure. About an hour later, Kathy came back to the store after her lunch break, and inside she saw there was a young woman standing at the back of the store by a rack of shirts. The woman's clothes were a bit ragged, and she looked out of place, like she wasn't the typical clientele for the store. And as Kathy got closer to her, she realized it was her coworker's daughter, Jessica Fisher. And Jessica really put Kathy on edge, because Jessica had a drug problem. And every once in a while, she would come into the store and she would ask Kathy for some of Kathy's Xanax. And Kathy felt bad for her, so even though she knew it was a bad idea and it was wrong to do this, she usually would give Jessica some of her Xanax. But today, Jessica looked so sick and so agitated that Kathy really had to face the truth here. Jessica had a serious addiction and she really had to stop enabling it. So when Jessica invariably asked Kathy if she had any pills on her, Kathy put her foot down and said no. And Jessica did not take that well. She started screaming at Kathy. It caused this huge scene. There were other customers inside looking over. And at some point, Kathy's manager came running over to see what was going on. Eventually, Jessica did sort of give up and she ran out of the store. But the whole encounter really left Kathy feeling shaken up. And for the rest of her shift, it was all she could think about. That night, just after the men's store closed at 5 p.m., Kathy came out the front door accompanied by one of her male coworkers. She was afraid that Jessica might be out here waiting to confront her. And so she had asked one of the other shoe salesmen, a guy named Charles March, to just walk her to her car. And so now, the two of them, Charles and Kathy, as they exited the store and made their way across the lot, they both were sort of on high alert, waiting to see if Jessica was going to pop out somewhere. But Kathy didn't see Jessica or anybody else lurking around, so eventually she got to her SUV, she said goodnight to Charles, and then she climbed into her car. Once inside the car, she locked all the doors and then exhaled in relief. She felt safe. And then as she started the engine, she called her longtime boyfriend, Fred. Fred was actually out of town on a fishing trip, and when he answered, Kathy told him that she was going to stop by his apartment that night and just clean it up for him before he came home. Now, Fred told her that she really didn't have to do that, but she insisted. She said she would head over there later that night, and then she hung up. But before she went to Fred's, Kathy actually planned to make another stop at the home of her ex-husband, or one of her ex-husbands, David McCartney. So Kathy and David had been divorced for 20 years now, but they had had 2 kids together, so they stayed in touch. A few years ago, David had actually had a stroke, and while he survived the stroke, his health still never fully recovered, and he wasn't remarried and didn't have anybody taking care of him, so Kathy would often stop by to help him out whenever she could, and so that was her plan for tonight, to just swing by, see if he was doing okay. So after hanging up with Fred and putting her phone in her purse, she threw her car in gear and she drove off towards David's house. A few hours later, around 8:30 p.m., Kathy was chatting on the phone with her friend Laura while she drove toward her boyfriend Fred's apartment. She had just been at David's house and she had helped him with some chores, and then after she had left, she had swung by Walmart to pick up some food and cleaning supplies, and now she was telling Laura that she was actually sort of looking forward to cleaning up Fred's apartment and then just having some alone time, that night afterwards. Kathy eventually reached Fred's apartment, and so she parked her SUV in the driveway, and she's still on the phone with Laura, and she walked up towards Fred's apartment. But as she was unlocking the door, she looked and noticed there was someone walking towards her. And so she told Laura that she had to go, then she hung up, and she pushed the apartment door open. 2 days later, on the morning of Monday, April 26th, Kathy Gobel's 36-year-old son, Jason McCartney, knocked on the door of her house, which was located on a quiet suburban road. That morning, Jason had gotten a call from Kathy's boss saying that she hadn't come into work, and she also wasn't answering her phone, which just was not like her. Jason had tried calling his mother too, but she hadn't answered him either. So now he was at her house to make sure she was okay. But no one was answering the door. So Jason pulled out his own key and he let himself inside. And then once he was inside, he began walking all around, calling out for his mom, searching every room, but there was no sign of her. She wasn't there. And there was no sign of her purse, which she brought with her everywhere. And then when he went into the garage, he saw that her SUV was also missing. So at this point, Jason pulled out his phone and he called his mother's boyfriend, Fred, to see if maybe she was with him. But Fred said no. And in fact, he said he hadn't heard from her since Saturday evening. Fred said he'd gotten home the day before on Sunday from his fishing trip, but when he got home, he'd found Kathy's cell phone, her spare car keys, and her medication just sitting on his kitchen counter, but Kathy herself was not there, and also neither was her car. And so at this point, Jason had a really bad feeling that something wasn't right here, but he knew who to call, his childhood friend, Detective Brian Carper of the Kanawha County Sheriff's Department. Later that morning, Detective Carper walked up to the door of Fred Farrell's apartment, which was on the other side of town from Kathy's house. Carper had spoken to Jason, and he had found out that his mother had left her belongings here at Fred's apartment on Saturday night, and no one had heard from her in the 40 hours since then. Also, her silver Honda SUV was nowhere to be found. So Carper had been friends with Jason for decades, and in that time, not only did he become close, obviously, with Jason, but also with Jason's mom. So because he knew Kathy fairly well, he knew this whole situation was just very out of character for her. And so right away, he's thinking, this has got to be something serious. And so with a sense of urgency, Carper knocked on Fred's apartment door, and a few seconds later, a spry, active-looking man in his mid-70s answered the door, and he invited Carper inside, and they sat down at the kitchen table. Carper began by asking Fred when was the last time he had spoken to Kathy. And he told him that Kathy had called him on Saturday night while he was off on a fishing trip, and that she had told him that she was going to go over to his apartment while he was away and clean it for him so that when he got home, it would be, nice and tidy. And when Carper looked around the apartment he was in, he did notice that it was clean. In fact, it was like spotless, as if the entire apartment had been scrubbed top to bottom. But Carper didn't call attention to that. Instead, he just told Fred to go on. And so Fred said that when he'd come home from the fishing trip on Sunday, so the day before, Kathy hadn't been there. But several lights in his apartment had been left on, a window was open, and some of Kathy's things had been left out on the counter. And also, the apartment was clearly very clean, so it seemed like she had been here at least for a while, but she was not there anymore. And so Carper glanced over at Fred's counter, and he did see there was a phone, a pill bottle, and a set of spare car keys that clearly belonged to Kathy. And Carper turned back to Fred and he said, did it strike you as odd that she was gone but left behind these really important items? And Fred just said, no, it actually wasn't odd. that Kathy was sometimes quite forgetful. However, when Fred said this, he distinctly looked away from Carper, like he wasn't meeting him eye to eye when he said that Kathy was forgetful. And so Carper began to think that Fred seemed pretty nervous. And it also definitely had not escaped him that Fred had also just referred to Kathy in the past tense, that she was forgetful, not that she is forgetful. Almost like he already knew that she might be dead, even though at this point she was only missing. And so to Carper, all of this seemed really suspicious. So he told Fred that he would have to come down to the station right now for additional questioning. Fred agreed to it, and as the men stood up from the table and headed for the door, Carper grabbed Kathy's car keys off the counter and put them in his pocket. Later that afternoon, back at the Kanawha County Sheriff's Office, Detective Carper looked over a copy of Kathy's phone records. By this point in the day, they'd already interrogated Fred, but he was sticking to his story about the fishing trip. Carper had also gone to the men's store where Kathy worked and had spoken to her coworkers, but none of them had any clue where Kathy could have gone. One of the shoe salesmen confirmed that he had walked Kathy out to the parking lot around 5 p.m. on Saturday, and he had watched her drive away, but that was the last time any of them had seen or heard from her. But now, as Carper scanned the list of calls that Kathy had made and received that Saturday, he saw that after she had left work that night, she had answered 2 incoming calls. One was from a woman named Laura Henderson, and the other was from her ex-husband, David McCartney. And so Carper wrote down both their names and then looked up their addresses. He was hoping that one of them could help fill in the gaps of what Kathy had done after work that night. A short while later, Detective Carper was sitting in the living room of Kathy's ex-husband, David McCartney. And David told the detective that he had heard about Kathy's disappearance from their son, Jason, and he was shocked to hear about it because he'd actually seen Kathy on the night she vanished. He told Carper that on Saturday, after Kathy had gotten off of work, she had come over to his house. And when she was there, she had helped him pay some bills that he had forgotten about, in part because his memory was not that great ever since his stroke. But he said Kathy hadn't really stayed very long at his house before she said she just had to leave, and then she had gone. And Carper really didn't know what to make of this, because now it was clear that David, at least so far, was the last person to have seen Kathy in person. But Carper really wasn't seeing a motive here. I mean, if anything, all he was seeing is that David felt an enormous amount of appreciation and gratitude toward his ex-wife. And then on top of that, David was not exactly young, and also he had some pretty serious mobility issues from the stroke he had had. And so Carper really wasn't even sure that somebody in David's condition would be able to hurt or kidnap Kathy, even if he had really wanted to. And also, Carper had to remind himself that he still wasn't even sure if anyone had hurt or kidnapped Kathy. After all, it's only been a couple of days now, and it was entirely possible that maybe she was safe somewhere and she would turn up and that this was just a big misunderstanding. However, there was still one more person that Carper really wanted to follow up with before he drew any initial conclusions. And that was the last person on Kathy's call records, Laura Henderson. And so later that same day, Carper sat down across from Laura Henderson in her living room. And Laura seemed really upset when Carper told her that she may have been the last person to speak to Kathy before she disappeared. At some point, he asked Laura whether Kathy had said anything on that last phone call about what she was up to that night, or if she had had any recent issues with anyone, or, anything odd. And Laura, she shook her head and said no, but then she stopped and she said, well, actually, there was one thing about that call that had stuck out to her as being a little bit strange. She said the last thing Kathy had said before hanging up was, "We're going into Fred's apartment." Not, "I'm going into Fred's apartment," but "We're going into Fred's apartment." We, like she was with someone. Carper was sort of surprised by this because his understanding is that Kathy had gone to Fred's apartment to clean it by herself based on what she had sort of communicated to Fred. And so he asked Laura if she had any idea who this other person was that she could have been with. And Laura said no. She said that Kathy had made no mention of there being another person with her on the entire call. In fact, the first mention of there being this other person was basically right at the end of the call when she had hung up. She basically had said to Laura, "We're going in," and then she had hung up. And so Carper spoke with Laura for a few more minutes, and then shortly after he left her house, his cell phone rang. And when he answered it, it was an officer on the line who said he had found Kathy's SUV. It had been abandoned on the highway about 15 miles outside of town. Carper said he would be there right away. Later that same Monday afternoon, so we're still just 48 hours after the last time anyone had seen or heard from Kathy, Carper parked on the side of the highway in a wooded area outside of Charleston. And through his windshield, he saw a silver Honda SUV parked a few yards ahead of him, right next to an exit. And right away, he recognized the license plate as being Kathy's. And so Carper got out of his car, and as he approached Kathy's SUV, he saw there was a white towel hanging out of the driver's side window, which was normally a signal that a car had broken down. All the doors were locked, so Carper pulled Kathy's spare key that he had grabbed out of Fred's apartment out of his pocket, and he used it to unlock the driver's side door. There was nobody inside the car, and there was no sign of a struggle, there was no blood anywhere, and also Kathy's purse was not inside either. So Carper had to wonder if maybe Kathy had been driving along this road and then her car, ran into some trouble and she walked off to get help when nobody had stopped. However, just to make sure, Carper sat in the driver's seat and he used his spare key and he tried the engine just to see if it would work. And as soon as he turned the key, the car started. The car was running just fine. And he also saw there was a half a tank of gas left. So at first glance, it appeared like, this didn't really make any sense. Why is this car abandoned here with the white towel in the window signifying that this car has broken down when the car works just fine or appears to work just fine? And so Carper, at this point, he began to think this is a sign that Kathy likely had not disappeared by choice here. There was just no good reason why she would have driven 15 miles out of town without her phone in the middle of the night, tell no one, abandon her car on the side of the highway, and just walk off. Why would she do that? And so to Carper, it seemed like the most plausible explanation here was that Kathy had been abducted. And whoever had done it also dumped her car out here with the towel in the window just to throw off investigators. Two days later, on the morning of April 28, 2010, Detective Carper walked into the men's clothing store where Kathy worked. Now, by this point, he had already spoken to Kathy's coworkers once on the day that she was reported missing. But now that he had learned from Laura that there was apparently someone else with her on Saturday night, he now really wanted to question everybody again to see if they had any idea who this other person might have been. So he tracked down Kathy's manager and he asked her if he could speak to her and ask her a few more questions. And she said sure. And she led him over to a quiet part of the store where the customers wouldn't hear them. And so Carper, he pulled out his notepad and he asked her, the manager, to walk through what Kathy did during her final shift and be as detailed as possible. The manager said it had been a pretty normal day. Kathy had come in around 9 a.m. and helped out a few customers. The only thing that stuck out to her was that at some point in the afternoon, another coworker's daughter had come into the store, and Kathy and this daughter had gotten into a really big argument, a very public, nasty argument. Now, the manager said she really had no idea what the fight was even about, but just if they wanted to follow up, the daughter's name was Jessica Fisher. And so Carper, he wrote down Jessica's name and made a note to look into her. After that, he asked the manager if she had seen Kathy interact with basically anybody else that day, any other meaningful interaction that he should know about. And the manager thought for a second and said, actually, yes, there was someone. She said that Kathy had gone out to lunch with a friend who also happened to be a regular customer at the store. She said his name was Dr. Harry King. Later that same day, Carper sat down inside of an interrogation room with Harry King, and Harry seemed really nervous. And when Carper asked if he knew why he was there, Harry said yes. Harry then put his head in his hands and he said, I know I should have come in sooner, but I was just afraid of what was going to happen. He explained that he and Kathy were not just friends. They were having an affair. He said they'd even gone on a trip to San Francisco together a couple of weeks ago, and they'd both lied to their respective partners about it. Carper was really surprised by this, and right away he wondered if maybe Kathy's boyfriend, Fred, had found out about the affair and killed Kathy out of jealousy. Or maybe things had gone bad between Harry and Kathy, their affair had gone south, and Harry had killed her. It did seem really suspicious that Harry clearly knew Kathy was missing, but hadn't come forward to the police. He had to be asked to come in. So Carper asked Harry to just go ahead and explain where he had been on Saturday night. And Harry said he'd been at home all night with his wife. And so Carper asked if he could speak to Harry's wife to verify his alibi. And immediately, Harry pleaded with the detective not to bring his wife into this, doesn't want to give up that he's having an affair here. But eventually, he seemed to understand that without an alibi, he was the primary suspect here. So he agreed and gave Carper his wife's phone number. A few days later, on May 1st, so a week after Kathy was last seen and she's still missing, Carper walked up the steps of a cheap motel on the edge of town. He'd finally tracked down Jessica Fisher, the co-worker's daughter who had gotten into a fight with Kathy at the men's clothing store on the day she disappeared. And this motel was apparently where she was staying. And so Carper figured out which room was Jessica's, and then he knocked on the door. And then a moment later, the door opened, and there was Jessica. And Jessica did not look well. She was unbelievably skinny, like gaunt skinny. She looked sick. In fact, Carper basically assumed that based on her physical appearance, she very likely was struggling with addiction. And so Carper, after introducing himself and confirming that this was in fact Jessica Fisher, he explained to her why he was there. He said that Kathy Goebel is missing, and we know you got into a fight with her on the day she vanished at the store where she works. And so he asked her to explain what the fight was about. After hearing all this, Jessica's eyes went wide and she insisted that she had no idea what had happened to Kathy. And when Carper pressed her again about why they had fought in the store that day, Jessica was kind of evasive at first, but then finally she just broke down and she admitted that she had been asking Kathy for drugs and Kathy had said no and they had fought about it. She said that sometimes Kathy would give her Xanax, but that day Kathy had refused. So Jessica said she got mad and sort of freaked out, and that was the fight. But Jessica swore that once another worker had intervened, she had just left the store and gone home and never seen Kathy again. Like that really was all it was. Now, Carper's reaction to this is, it sounded an awful lot like Jessica was telling the truth. But he still asked her if she would take a polygraph test, just to be sure. And she said yes, of course. And so Carper gave her his business card, and they agreed on a date and time for her to come into the station for that test. But when that date and time rolled around, Jessica never showed up. In May of 2010, so a couple of weeks after Kathy Goebel disappeared, Detective Brian Carper was looking through a forensics report at his desk. Kathy's car that had been found on the side of the highway had been processed for evidence. But as this report showed, no DNA or fingerprints had been found inside or on it from anyone other than Kathy. Now, this didn't mean that, someone could not have dumped Kathy's car on the side of the road. It just meant that if that happened, whoever did it was very careful to cover their tracks, and forensic evidence was not going to help pin them down. And this was very frustrating for Carper, because so far, all his leads were sort of coming up dry. Dr. Harry King's wife had confirmed his alibi, and when Carper had spoken to her, she had seemed very upset to learn that her husband was having an affair. So Carper didn't think she would want to lie for him. She probably was telling the truth, that he really was there with her. Carper had questioned Kathy's 2 adult sons, Jason and Paul, but they both came in and passed polygraph tests and were ruled out as suspects. As for Jessica Fisher, the young woman who had gotten into a fight with Kathy in the store over Kathy not giving her Xanax pills, well, she had agreed to come in and take a polygraph, but she hadn't shown up, and currently she was still MIA. And even though Kathy's boyfriend, Fred, and ex-husband, David, both still seemed pretty suspicious, there really was nothing concrete tying them to Kathy's disappearance. And so as the weeks passed by, Carper just had no idea what happened to Kathy. There hadn't been any activity on her bank accounts or credit cards since the day she vanished, so it seemed pretty clear that she had not just run off, because you'd see transactions. However, it probably meant then that she was being held captive or something, or maybe she was dead, but Carper just didn't know. And so this was a pretty unusual case, because Carper did have several pretty solid suspects, but no actual evidence that a crime had even been committed. And so unless Kathy was found, dead or alive, or some new evidence was uncovered, it would be impossible to charge anyone in connection with her disappearance. And so as weeks turned to months and Kathy just continued not to turn up, the case ultimately went cold. 2 years later, on April 25th, 2012, Detective Carper trudged through the mud and puddles in the parking lot of the police station and then wiped his shoes on the mat outside the front door. It had been raining for days now, and the rivers and the creeks around Charleston had all flooded, and the whole city was basically a swampy mess. As Carper walked to his office, an officer suddenly ran up to him and said that a 911 call had just come in, and Carper would definitely want to hear about it. The officer said that according to this caller, all the rain they had been having had unearthed a human body that clearly had been buried at some point on the edge of town. And as he explained where this body had been found, Carper's heart began to race. He understood why the officer had brought this to him specifically, because that body had to be Kathy Goebel. Based on the place of burial and other forensic evidence, this is what police believe happened to Kathy Goebel on the night of April 24th, 2010. Around 8:30 p.m., the killer was waiting outside of Fred's apartment. They knew Kathy would be coming by that night, and soon they saw the headlights of her SUV coming up the street. As Kathy got out of her car with a plastic grocery bag and a phone to her ear, the killer approached the doorstep and waved. And Kathy, who was still on the phone, she sort of seemed surprised to see the killer, but, nonetheless, she continued talking on the phone, and she didn't say anything to the killer, as she just continued to unlock the door, open it up, and sort of gestured for the killer to come on in with them. Once inside, Kathy set the shopping bag and a few of her other things down on the counter, and then once she'd hung up the phone, she asked the killer what were they doing there. And the killer just asked her if she would take a drive somewhere with them. And Kathy seemed a little confused by the request, but said okay. The killer waited for a few minutes while Kathy cleaned up the apartment, because that was something she said that she wanted to do. And then once she was done, they both left the apartment, they got in the killer's car, and the killer drove them to another house, way out on the edge of town. And once they were there, they went inside, and the killer asked Kathy if she wanted to have sex with them. And Kathy said no. And this rejection sent the killer into like an instant rage. And they grabbed her, they tied her up, and they strangled her. And then when she stopped moving, they dragged her lifeless body into a bathtub, and they grabbed a saw and they cut off her arms, her legs, and her head. Then they took her severed body parts and they buried her in a shallow grave in their backyard. But 2 years later, the killer's son noticed something in their backyard after all this heavy rain, and when he went out there to see what was in the middle of the yard, he found her body. The shoe salesman, Charles March, who ironically had been the one to walk Kathy out to her car on the day she vanished to keep her safe from Jessica Fisher after that fight. He was the person that she trusted to keep her safe. He was her killer. It would turn out Charles, who at no point was even considered as a suspect in this case, actually had a history of stalking women. And investigators believe he'd grown obsessed with Kathy while working with her, and then he eventually killed her when she rejected his advances. Charles March was arrested on April 25, 2012, and charged with Kathy's murder. He pled guilty and was sentenced to life in prison. However, he died of cancer in prison just 2 years later in 2014. On the night of September 21st, 2013, 39-year-old Joe Connell clinked his fork against a champagne glass to get the attention of his friends and family, who were sitting together on a restaurant patio in Wilmington, Delaware. Everyone at the large table quieted down as Joe stood up and raised his glass. He looked over at his wife Olga sitting right by him, and he smiled at her. Then he cleared his throat and made a toast. He said that he still couldn't believe that he'd been lucky enough to meet and marry a beautiful, brilliant woman like Olga. And he was so excited to be there with the people they loved to wish her a happy 39th birthday. Everyone at the table shouted happy birthday, toasted Olga, and then drank their champagne. Olga blushed, and Joe laughed a bit. He knew how shy his wife could be when the attention was on her. But he sat down and put his arm around her and told her that she deserved all the attention. After all, this was her special day. A few minutes later, as the group was talking and eating, Joe felt his phone buzz in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw there was a text message. He read it, then quickly replied, and then jumped back into the conversation at the table. But pretty much right away, loud music began playing from inside the restaurant, and Olga immediately got excited. The music meant that the dance floor in this large restaurant and bar was now open, and the dance floor was one of the big reasons they'd chosen this place to celebrate here in the first place. Because as shy as Olga was in a lot of social situations, she actually loved to let loose and dance. And so Joe instinctively stood up, looked over at his wife and took her hand, and then together they walked inside the restaurant. Once inside, they immediately hit the dance floor, and for a minute, Joe just stood there watching his wife dance. She had beautiful blonde hair, she was wearing a nice dress, and she had on sparkling pieces of expensive jewelry. Joe had meant every word in his short birthday toast. He really couldn't believe how lucky he was to be married to this woman. The couple had met online about 3 years earlier, when Joe was just coming out of the craziest and most difficult period of his life. Joe had gotten into this drunken brawl and ended up pulling out a gun, and the police got involved. Joe had said the gun was not loaded, but that event still had landed Joe in prison for almost 6 years. And when he'd gotten out, he'd vowed to clean up his life. And pretty quickly after getting out, 2 things made that possible. 1, he'd become co-owner of an auto repair shop with his best friend Chris, and 2, he'd met Olga. Joe and Olga had gotten along right away, and so they quickly set up a date. And as soon as they hung out in person, Joe thought Olga was the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen, and one of the smartest people he'd ever met. Olga had grown up in Russia, and while she was there, she'd received college degrees in physics and chemistry. Now, Joe never thought of himself as being a particularly smart guy. He thought he was just a really good car mechanic. But Olga, she fell for him the same way he fell for her. She thought he was funny and outgoing, and it didn't hurt that she thought he was handsome and in great shape. And so, not long after their initial meeting, they moved in together, and then eventually, in June of 2013, they got married, just a few months before Olga's 39th birthday. Back on the dance floor, Joe shouted over the loud music and told his wife how amazing she looked tonight. Olga wrapped her arms around his neck, and they started dancing together. And before they knew it, hours had flown by. The dance floor had all but cleared, and the restaurant staff was now starting to shut things down for the night. Joe and Olga said goodbye to the few friends who'd stayed to dance with them, and then they too left the restaurant. On the drive home, Joe and Olga talked and laughed, still wired from their night out. But at one point, Joe got this sad look on his face, and Olga asked if something was wrong. Joe shook his head and said he was just sorry that his little sister Kelly hadn't been at the party. Olga didn't say it, but she knew that Kelly hadn't just missed the party. Kelly had not been invited. Because Joe and his younger sister were in the middle of a full-on feud, and they had completely stopped talking to each other. And as much as it upset Joe not to have Kelly in his life anymore, he could not bring himself to reconcile with her. But Olga didn't want anything to spoil her perfect birthday, so she quickly changed the subject. And within a few minutes, Joe was laughing again. Around 1:30 a.m., Joe pulled his car into a parking spot in front of his and Olga's condo. Olga got out of the car and headed down the walkway towards their front door. Joe moved kind of slowly and trailed behind her. Olga pulled her keys out of her purse, and right as she was about to unlock the door, she heard a strange noise coming from behind her. Not long after that, Officer Kelly Richards of the Newcastle County Police Department got out of her cruiser and headed up the walkway towards Joe and Olga's condo. Just a few minutes earlier, emergency dispatch had been flooded with calls from people in the surrounding condos saying they had just heard gunshots, and one caller had been sure he could see a body. Richards was the first cop on the scene, but she saw paramedics crouched down by the front door of the condo, furiously trying to help someone who was on the ground. Richards approached, and she saw there was an unconscious blonde woman in a dress laying there. Blood was pouring from the woman's cheek and head onto the concrete, and Richards thought it looked like she'd been shot. The woman was still breathing though, but just barely. Richards saw there was a ring with several diamonds in it on the woman's finger. So Richards' first thought was that the attacker must not have been here to rob this woman. Officer Richards saw more paramedics rushing down the walkway with a gurney, so she moved out of the way. But as Richards watched the paramedics wheel this woman to a nearby ambulance, she realized something strange. Richards knew this woman. Suddenly, Officer Richards looked around and really took in the condo and the surrounding area, and then it hit her. This woman, who was being rushed to the hospital, was Olga Connell. Less than 2 months earlier, Officer Richards had worked a burglary case at this condo because someone had broken in and stolen a bunch of Olga's expensive jewelry. Just then, Richards heard cars screech to a stop in the parking lot, and it sort of snapped her out of her daze. She saw several police officers coming her way, looking at her expectantly, and she told them they needed to do a sweep of the area. And it didn't take long before Richards heard one of the officers calling her name. She saw the officer crouching down near some bushes a few yards away from the front door, and so Richards walked over and joined the officer. And there, half hidden by the bushes, she saw the body of a man who had been shot multiple times, and it was clear he was already dead. Officer Richards knelt down and shined her flashlight to get a clear look at the man's face, and right away she recognized him too. This was Olga's husband, Joe. Officer Richards had met with him several times during that burglary investigation. Around this time, Officer Richards looked over and saw the lead investigator, Detective Jamie Leonard, getting out of his car. Richards got up and walked over to him, but before she could say anything, Detective Leonard told her that he'd just gotten news that the woman who'd been found at the scene here had died on the way to the hospital. So they were now dealing with what looked like a double homicide. Officer Richards said she knew both victims. Their names were Olga and Joe Connell, and their condo had actually been robbed back in July. But Richards said that wasn't all. While the police had never arrested anyone in connection with that robbery, Joe Connell had suspected he knew who robbed them. And police had even interviewed this person. It was Joe's own little sister, Kelly. That afternoon, Detective Leonard sat at his desk looking over crime scene photos, waiting for Joe's sister, Kelly, to get to the station. And as he looked at photos of Olga laying by the front door and Joe laying several yards away in the bushes, he had a theory that he just couldn't shake. Leonard had spent the entire morning with Officer Richards and a few others combing the area around the condo, and a couple of things had stood out to him. The first was that the bushes where Joe's body had been found were littered with 9mm bullet casings. However, they also found .22 caliber casings on site, and the report Leonard had received from the hospital where Olga had been taken stated that her bullet wounds had come from a .22. Now, Leonard knew it was possible that the killer could have just had 2 different guns on them. But based on how far apart the bodies had been found, he thought it was more likely that there had been 2 shooters at the scene, one to kill Olga and one to kill Joe. And if that was the case, Leonard thought there was a good chance that these murders had been planned, and that they were not the result of some kind of spur-of-the-moment argument or anything like that. Detective Leonard's door opened and an officer stepped inside. He told Leonard that Joe's sister Kelly had just arrived and was waiting in one of the interview rooms. Leonard put the crime scene photos back in a folder, put on his suit jacket, and then walked out of his office. Detective Leonard reached the interview room, went inside, and sat down at a table across from Kelly. And right away, his first impression was she looked like she hadn't slept all night. Joe and Olga's immediate families had all been informed about the murders. But since Olga's family was in Russia, Joe's parents and his 2 siblings were the ones dealing directly with the police. And Leonard knew that could take a toll on someone. So he started the interview with what he thought was a simple question. What was Kelly's relationship with her brother Joe like? But just hearing this question sent Kelly into a total breakdown. She began sobbing and she struggled to catch her breath. She said that she and Joe had actually been fighting and had stopped talking to each other. But now he was dead, and so she'd never get a chance to talk to him again. Detective Leonard just sat there quietly and let Kelly cry for a few minutes. As far as he could tell, Kelly was truly upset about the death of her brother. But Leonard also knew that didn't necessarily mean she was totally innocent. When Kelly finally composed herself and said she was okay to continue, Detective Leonard laid everything out. He told her he knew about the burglary at Joe and Olga's condo, and he knew she, Kelly, had been interviewed by police in connection to that crime. He also assumed that that's why she and her brother had stopped talking to each other. But Kelly said no, that her and Joe had actually started fighting before all that. And then Kelly leaned forward and began telling her story. And as she did, Detective Leonard just sat there thinking, this sounds totally insane. Kelly told the detective that years ago, her mother had given her the most beautiful ring with a bunch of diamonds in it. The ring was a family heirloom, and her mom had wanted to pass it on to her only daughter. Kelly had treasured this ring and dreamed of it being her engagement ring someday. Then, a few months ago, Kelly's mother had asked if she could borrow the ring so she could wear it on a trip she was taking. Kelly said of course. After all, it had been her mother's ring for a long time before Kelly got it. However, when her mom had returned the ring, Kelly knew right away that something was wrong. The ring looked different. So, on a hunch, Kelly had brought the ring to a jeweler, and the jeweler said there were no diamonds in this ring. There were only cubic zirconias. Cubic zirconias are cheaper stones that are often used to imitate diamonds. Kelly told Detective Leonard that she'd been really confused at first. But pretty soon, everything clicked when she heard that Joe had given Olga this beautiful engagement ring with several diamonds in it. And so Kelly got in touch with Olga, wanting to know if those diamonds had come from her family heirloom ring. Olga had said she had no idea what Kelly was talking about, but it hadn't taken long for Kelly to get her mom and Joe to admit what they had done. They had taken the diamonds out of Kelly's ring when she lent it to her mother, put those diamonds in a new ring for Olga, and put cubic zirconias in the original, gave it back to Kelly, and just hoped Kelly wouldn't notice. At this point, Kelly stopped talking. And at first, Detective Leonard really didn't know what to say. This was like the plot twist of a heist movie or something. But he quickly got back on track. He asked point blank if Kelly had broken into Joe and Olga's condo to try to steal the diamonds back, or to steal other jewelry to get back at Joe for what he'd done. At this point, Kelly broke down again. She said she had nothing to do with the burglary. And as angry as she was, Joe was still her brother, and she loved him. Leonard wrapped up the interview by asking Kelly where she had been when Joe and Olga had been killed. And Kelly said she'd been home alone. She knew that was not a great alibi, but it was the truth. After the interview ended, Leonard considered Kelly to be a major suspect. But he didn't have any concrete evidence to hold her, so he had to let her go. The detective had not slept in a while, but he had no intention of stopping anytime soon. And after Kelly's crazy story, he wanted to talk to someone outside of the family about Joe, someone who would not have been mixed up in the family feud and who hadn't swiped any diamonds. So Leonard headed across town to Joe's auto repair shop. Later that afternoon, still not even 24 hours after Joe and Olga's bodies had been found, Detective Leonard walked across the parking lot of the auto repair shop that Joe had co-owned. He saw several mechanics hard at work on different cars, and he also saw a few guys who looked like they'd just come by the shop to hang out. They seemed a little strange to Leonard, but he didn't think too much about it. He walked into a small lobby, and he saw a man who looked like he was around 30 sitting behind the counter. Detective Leonard introduced himself and showed his badge, and the man behind the counter stood up. He said his name was Chris Rivers, and he asked if there was a problem. Leonard asked him if he knew who Joe Connell was. Immediately, Chris let out a big sigh, and a very annoyed look came across his face. He looked right at Leonard and said, "What did he do now?" This was not what the detective had expected. In fact, it really threw him off. Leonard had planned to come by the shop, learn a bit about Joe, and then leave. But now, he wondered if Chris might have information about something illegal Joe had been mixed up in. So, right there on the spot, Leonard changed his plan, and he asked Chris if he wouldn't mind coming to the station to answer some questions. The sun had begun to set by the time Detective Leonard and Chris sat down together inside of an interview room. Based on what Chris had said at the auto repair shop, it seemed like he had no idea Joe had been killed, and Leonard didn't tell him. Instead, the detective asked Chris what he did at the auto repair shop. Chris said he co-owned the place with Joe, but sometimes he felt like he was doing everything by himself. Leonard asked him to elaborate, and so Chris said, Joe seemed to like the idea of owning the business way more than actually running the business. Leonard smiled like he could relate, and he asked Chris if Joe's behavior upset him. Chris said of course it did. It was hard enough keeping the shop open, let alone profitable. But suddenly, Chris stopped talking and just stared at Detective Leonard. Chris realized he'd just started ranting and still had no idea why he was there. So he asked again, what had Joe done? At this point, Detective Leonard knew he had to tell Chris what was going on. So he said Joe hadn't done anything. Instead, someone had murdered Joe and his wife. Everything about Chris's demeanor immediately changed. His face went blank and he looked kind of pale. He started shaking his head. He said there was no way. Joe couldn't be gone. But Leonard said it was true. And right away, Chris got mad at himself. He couldn't believe he'd just trashed his best friend like that because of some stupid work stuff. Just like Leonard had done with Kelly, he let Chris sit there for a while and collect himself. Then, at some point, when there was a lull, the detective asked Chris when the last time he had seen Joe was. Chris said he had seen Joe the day before at work. But after he said that, Chris suddenly paused, like something had just hit him. He told Leonard somewhat emotionally that he was actually supposed to go to Olga's birthday party the night before, and he had gone to the restaurant, but when he was outside, he realized he had left his wallet back at the shop. He was already feeling annoyed that he'd had to work late, so instead of going to the party and seeing his friends one last time, he had just bailed, gotten his wallet, and headed home. And now he felt really bad about it. And so Detective Leonard asked a few follow-up questions about Chris's relationship with Joe and with Olga and how they met each other and things like that. And then eventually, Detective Leonard said he had just one more question for the time being. He asked Chris, when they had first met, why had he assumed Joe had done something that would have gotten him in trouble with the police. Chris took a breath and then said he had never told anyone this, but he knew that Joe was a big-time illegal steroid user. That's how he stayed in such great physical shape. However, Chris said over the past several months, Joe had gone from just using steroids to dealing them. In the days following the interview with Chris, Detective Leonard really started to dig into Joe's past, particularly his time in prison. Leonard and his team met with prison staff and people who'd been on the inside with Joe, and a lot of them said the same thing. When Joe was in prison, he had become very good friends with his cellmate, who was a member of a motorcycle gang called the Pagans. And Detective Leonard knew all about the Pagans. They were directly connected to the drug trade in Wilmington and in cities across the East Coast. So he wondered if maybe Joe had gotten mixed up with the gang after he had gotten out. Maybe he had made them angry, or took too much money on a drug deal and they retaliated. So Leonard methodically tracked down members of this gang and asked them if Joe Connell had been dealing drugs for them. Now, most of the members admitted to knowing Joe, but getting any information beyond that proved to be very difficult. This didn't surprise Leonard, because drug-dealing members of motorcycle gangs were not really known for talking to the police. But at the end of September, so about a week after the murders, Detective Leonard was sitting at his desk when an officer walked in with a strange look on his face. The door opened wider, and this huge, intimidating guy in a black leather jacket walked inside. And Detective Leonard couldn't believe it, because this man was one of the leaders of the Pagans. The leader sat down and told the detective that he was not there to try to protect himself or anybody in the biker gang. He was just there to set the record straight. He said that Joe had been a very good friend, and he was still shocked that somebody had killed him, but he told the detective that Joe had absolutely nothing to do with any drug deals the Pagans might be involved in. Joe was just a great mechanic who loved riding and working on motorcycles. Now, Detective Leonard knew how utterly bizarre it was that this man had 1, chosen to set foot in the police station, 2, actually speak to a detective, and 3, not even try to hide the fact that he had connections to the drug world. And so by the time this leader left, Leonard couldn't help but feeling like he must be telling the truth. Still though, the detective was not ready to just drop the drug lead altogether. Leonard did think Joe's sister Kelly was still a major suspect, but Olga had been wearing her diamond ring when she was found, so this being some kind of a drug-related hit, as opposed to a robbery attempt, made more sense to him. And soon, as his team kept looking into Joe's past, they found a new drug-related lead. That lead was a man named Josh Bay. Josh was a known drug dealer in town, and he had even worked as an FBI informant. But for Detective Leonard, the most important thing about Josh was that he seemed to spend a lot of his free time just sort of hanging out at Joe's auto repair shop. On October 4th, 2 weeks after the murders, Detective Leonard brought Josh Bay in for an interview. But it quickly became clear that this young man was not going to be all that helpful. In fact, Josh at first tried to play off that he didn't even know Joe or his business partner Chris. When Leonard pointed out that police had plenty of evidence that said he did know both men, Josh simply changed his story. He admitted he knew Joe and Chris, but only as the guys who worked on his car. Leonard pressed Josh, but it got him nowhere. Josh said he knew nothing about drug deals involving anyone at the auto shop, and he said he had no connection to Joe and Olga's murders. The detective didn't really believe anything Josh said, but he'd have to find proof that Josh was lying. So Leonard let him go, frustrated that he had good leads, but no clear evidence pointing to any of them. The following day, October 5th, Detective Leonard and members of his team stood at the back of a church for Joe's funeral, listening to a man sing Danny Boy over Joe's casket. As Leonard listened to the song, he scanned the church pews, looking at everyone who had come. And one thing stood out. Most of Joe's friends and family clearly believed Joe's sister Kelly was involved in the murders. Because nobody was speaking to Kelly. It was like the entire family was shunning her. Even though Leonard had leaned into Joe's potential drug connections over the past weeks, he had not crossed Kelly off his suspect list by any means. If she wasn't the one who had pulled the trigger, she could have helped plan the hit. And maybe she didn't want to rob Olga's diamond ring or her other jewelry because she knew that would lead police right back to her. So, standing there in the church, watching Kelly stand there uncomfortably, Detective Leonard wondered if maybe the murders were just a classic case of revenge. Four days later, on the evening of October 9th, Detective Leonard and his team gathered around a TV at the station to watch a local news show. This was not something they did often, but tonight, the news was running a story on Joe and Olga that would include interviews with people who had been close to the couple. Just like going to the funeral, Detective Leonard saw this as an opportunity to see if anyone would say or do something strange. The news show started, and at first it was pretty standard. A retrospective on Joe and Olga's lives and how much people love them. But during one interview segment, Leonard heard something that took him completely by surprise. He looked around at his team to make sure he hadn't misheard something, but they had all caught it too. And they knew it could be something huge. After the news show ended, Leonard didn't waste any time. He laid out a new strategy to pursue what he thought might be the most important lead they'd gotten since the night of the murders. Leonard's team worked tirelessly, but it would still take a lot longer than Leonard had hoped for them to secure enough concrete evidence to put together a case that would hold up in court. But in September of 2014, 1 year after the murders, police finally made an arrest. Now they had a clear picture of who killed Joe and Olga and how they pulled it off. Based on details from that news show, evidence found at the crime scene, and interviews conducted over the course of a year, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened outside of Joe and Olga's condo in the early morning of September 22nd, 2013. Around 1 a.m., the killers pulled their car into the condominium parking lot. They wore all black clothes and black gloves. The driver lifted their shirt, pulled a 9mm handgun from their waistband, and checked to make sure it was loaded. The passenger did the same with their .22. The killers scanned the parking lot and the surrounding area. It was well lit, but it was clear. Nobody was there. The driver nodded to the passenger, at which point the passenger stepped out of the car and quickly ran over to some bushes just a few yards away. The passenger crouched down, hid in the bushes, and kept their eyes fixed on Joe and Olga's front door. At the same time, the driver shut off the engine and sat in the car, waiting. About a half hour later, around 1:30 a.m., a car pulled into the parking lot. The driver could immediately feel themselves tense up. They looked out and saw a woman wearing a dress getting out of the car and heading up the walkway towards the front door, while a man followed shortly behind her. After a steadying breath, the driver gripped their 9mm and then stepped out of their car. And at that exact moment, right as Olga and Joe had reached the front door, the passenger leapt out of the bushes where they'd been hiding, sprinted towards Olga, and fired off 3 quick shots at her. The bullets struck Olga in the head, cheek, and upper back, and she immediately crumpled to the ground, covered in blood. Joe, who was right behind her, screamed in horror, but as he ran towards his wife, the driver unloaded their 9mm from right behind Joe. He got hit multiple times, but he actually stayed on his feet. Joe stumbled forward and tried to run to the bushes, looking for any way out of here, but the driver pursued him and kept firing their gun. Joe took rounds in the chest, arms, legs, and the back of his head. Finally, he hit the ground and died in the bushes. The driver ran back to the car and climbed inside. The passenger was already there, panting and trying to catch their breath. The driver started up the car, threw it in reverse, and peeled out of the lot. A few minutes later, when the killers were clear of the condo, the driver eased off the gas and told the passenger to let the person who had hired them know that the job was done. The 2 people who shot and killed Joe and Olga had no personal connection to them at all. They had simply been hired to do a job by Josh Bay, the drug dealer who had hung out at the auto repair shop. But Josh had also been hired by somebody else to carry out these murders. And the person who had hired Josh, and who was behind setting all of this up, was Joe's own best friend and business partner, Chris Rivers. For all of Chris's talk about Joe using and selling steroids, police discovered that it was actually Chris who appeared to have a major drug issue, with opioids and cocaine. And Chris's drug habit had begun to take a huge financial toll on him. He was basically burning through all his money. But Chris believed he had found a solution for all his problems. Chris and Joe had taken out a joint insurance policy for the auto repair business. Essentially, this policy would pay out a large lump sum to one owner and give that owner full control of the company if the other owner and any other beneficiaries died. This meant that to get the payout and to take sole control of the company, Chris would not only have to get rid of Joe, he would also have to get rid of Joe's possible beneficiary, Olga. So Chris reached out to his drug dealer, Josh Bay, for help. He offered Josh a cut of the insurance payout to murder Joe and Olga. But Josh had no intention of actually pulling the trigger himself, so he subcontracted the job out to 2 hired killers he knew from his work in the drug trade. On the night of Olga's birthday party, Chris texted Joe. He said he was finishing up something at work, but he wanted to know how late they'd be at the restaurant, because he still wanted to come to the party. Joe texted back that they would be there late, most likely until around closing time. Chris would pass that information on to Josh, and Josh would let the hired killers know so that they could be waiting at the condo when Joe and Olga got home. As Joe's business partner, Chris had been a suspect, but the bulk of the early investigation focused on Joe's sister Kelly and also on the possible drug angle with the Pagans motorcycle gang. But when Detective Leonard and his team watched the news show about Joe and Olga, they heard Chris say in an interview that on the night his 2 friends got killed, he had worked late and then gone straight home. This is not what Chris had originally told Detective Leonard. Chris had told Leonard that he had first driven to the restaurant for the birthday party, realized he'd forgotten his wallet, and then left and went home. This little change in Chris's story was like a massive alarm going off inside of Detective Leonard's head. So he and his team shifted their focus and dug deep into Chris's personal life and financial records, and they eventually discovered Chris's money problems, his drug habit, and his direct connection to the drug dealer, Josh Bay. Chris was charged with double homicide and found guilty, and he received 2 life sentences. Josh Bay got a plea deal and was sentenced to 5 years in prison. As for Joe's sister Kelly, despite her feud with her brother, she had nothing to do with the murders. And no evidence ever surfaced that she was at all involved in that burglary of Joe and Olga's condo. At 6:30 p.m. on May 14, 1955, a 24-year-old man named Donald Giroux stood next to his friend, 28-year-old Murray Anderson, on the shore of a natural spring in the state of Georgia. The spring was called Radium Springs because literally there was radium in the water. Radium is a naturally occurring, highly radioactive metallic element, but there were such low levels of it in the water that it wasn't really a hazard. However, the radium did have an effect on the water. It made it practically neon blue, and so it was totally mesmerizing. I mean, you look at this thing and you know there's something different about this spring. Also, this spring was incredibly deep. So Donald and Murray were both members of the US Navy, and so naturally they spent a lot of time, in and around water, because that's what the Navy does. They work in and around water. But ironically, it was actually when Donald and Murray were not working that they spent the most amount of time in the water, because in their off time, they were recreational scuba divers. Except back in 1955, recreational scuba diving was totally not safe. And that was because, underwater diving certainly existed at the time. I mean, institutions like the Navy, they were prolific divers. But civilians did not really dive on their own. And so as a result, if you wanted to recreationally scuba dive, well, you didn't really have access to good equipment or even proper equipment. I mean, there just wasn't anything available to you. And so for people like Donald and Murray who did want to go explore the underwater abyss on their own, they had to literally make their own diving equipment, like their own oxygen tanks and their own flashlights and goggles. I mean, all of it. I mean, it was amateur. It was homemade equipment. And so that's what made it really dangerous. On top of when you're underwater diving, as I've done myself, a lot of things can go wrong. And so that's also dangerous. And so the whole thing, it's asking for problems. But for Donald and Murray, it was actually the danger associated with recreational diving that made it so appealing. They liked the idea that other people were scared to go underwater, with their DIY equipment. For Donald and Murray, they loved it. They got a thrill out of it. And on top of that, they kind of felt like explorers. They got to go to places underwater where literally nobody else had gone before. In fact, they had already gone to other locations and mapped out, tunnels and underwater cave systems and all these different things that literally nobody else had done before. And they loved it. And today was going to be no different, because there were sections in Radium Springs that nobody had mapped, and they were going to go down there and see it for themselves. So after the two men looked at each other and nodded and just kind of gave the signal it was time to begin the dive, they donned their amateur equipment, their oxygen tanks and their goggles and their flippers, and then they walked into the neon blue water and submerged. A few minutes later, Donald and Murray had traveled about 70 feet straight down the water column. And at this point, the light is really fading. They can't really see too well. They did have flashlights that they had rigged up that they had waterproofed. But at this point, down 70 feet, it's getting pretty dark. But right in front of them, off to the side, was this huge entrance, this underwater tunnel entrance. And this was actually a well-known cavern. Like, this is actually where other recreational divers would go to if they went to Radium Springs. It was this cavern. But while the entrance to the cavern had been sort of mapped out and searched, there were all these little spidery offshoots once you got into this cavern that had not been explored. And so what Donald and Murray were going to do is go into the cavern and then basically start, splintering off and seeing what else was in there and mapping it out. Now, as much as Donald and Murray did like the sort of risks associated with this activity, they weren't completely reckless. They had attached a dive line when they had gone into the spring that they attached to the surface and they fed down with them. It's a 200-foot line, and they carried it with them. The lead diver would basically unspool as they went. The two divers would be right next to each other, and they'd be holding on to this line. And so when they would go into this cavern, if for some reason they got turned around or, if they got, totally confused, whatever it was, they could always just follow their line back out of the cavern, back up to the surface. This was not like rocket science. This is something that divers today still do. So using a dive line, very common practice, and Donald and Murray were doing just that. And so they went into this cavern, they got their dive line spooling out, and everything is totally fine. But once they were inside of this cavern, all the light completely went away. I mean, the cavern was relatively spacious, but, the light is coming straight down, and this tunnel entrance is basically, horizontal. And so once they're inside of this cavern, it's utterly pitch black. But Donald and Murray have dove other underwater cave systems. They knew going in how dark this cave system was going to be. They had their flashlights, that they had jerry-rigged to be waterproof, and they're holding on to their line, and they're going into this cavern looking for their first offshoot. But as they're going into this cavern, there's all this silt, all this mud that's kind of caked to the walls and the floor that began getting kicked up from their flippers and bumping into it. And before long, because of the silt and the lack of light, they could basically only see maybe 6 inches in front of them. Like even shining their light, all they'd see is all the silt. And so very quickly, the visibility basically fell to 0. But, again, they're going in knowing this is the environment they're going into. They're confident, they're cool, they're moving along. But as the two divers were continuing through the cavern, getting deeper and deeper, and it's starting to get more and more restrictive, the deeper they go, they were about to go into this offshoot when Donald suddenly started seeing all these air bubbles coming up against him. And now he can't quite see where they're coming from, but there's only one place that an air bubble could be emerging from, and that's from his oxygen tank. And so clearly there's some sort of issue. He can't see because it's so dark. He also has homemade equipment, and so the risk of catastrophic failure is pretty high with his equipment. And so he begins trying to figure out where this leak is coming from, checking his equipment, trying to make it stop, but he can't. He can't really communicate to Walter, who's got the spool of dive line, who's continuing straight forward into this offshoot. He can't quite tell him what's going on. They can't actually speak to each other. Again, it's pitch black, there's silt, it's sort of, claustrophobic and stressful. And so ultimately, Donald grabs Murray and just tries to shake him and sort of signal, hey, I got an issue here, but he had no way of knowing if Murray actually understood. But Donald, he knew he just had to get out of there. He had to go back to the surface and fix his issue before it got way worse. And so, even though he knew he was kind of leaving his buddy here, he's thinking, okay, Murray's got the dive line, he's experienced, I just grabbed him, everything's gonna be okay. And Donald turned around, kicked up more silt, and held onto that dive line, but now followed it back out of the cavern and back up to the surface. And when he got to the surface, he took a big breath. He was saved, he checked his equipment and realized, wherever the issue was, and he was actually able to fix the issue. And so before long, after only being on the surface for a couple of minutes, he had put his equipment back on, he was back in the water and following the dive line back down towards the cavern. As Donald began his descent down towards that cavern, 70 feet down, the whole time he's holding onto the dive line, making sure he doesn't lose that. But really what he's focused on is checking his equipment, because as he's going down, he's got basic visibility here. It's not gonna be like in the cavern where you can't see anything. And so as he's going down, he's checking his equipment and just making sure that there isn't a leak. And by the time he got all the way down 70 feet and the dive line turned and went into that cavern, Donald was feeling pretty good that his equipment was good, it was not malfunctioning, and it was safe to go back into the cavern with Murray. And so that's what he does. He's got his flashlight in one hand, he's got the dive line in the other, and he's now looking straight into this dark opening of this cavern, and in Donald goes, the whole time holding onto that dive line. And pretty much immediately, once inside the cavern, the flashlight became useless because again, the silt still kicked up, there's no current running through this cavern, so the silt is not going anywhere. But either way, Donald knew what he was doing. He was going straight in there to connect with Murray and continue this dive and see what else is in here and, map it out for other divers. And so into the cavern he goes, he's holding the dive line in one hand, he's got his flashlight and he's going deeper and deeper into this cavern. And the whole time he's expecting at any moment he's just gonna bump into Murray. But he just keeps going and going deeper and deeper into the system. The walls are getting tighter and tighter around him. And eventually he reaches the very end of the dive line, 200 feet at this point, deep into this cavern. And there's no Murray. Murray's gone. Now Donald, he's looking around. Remember, it's total darkness. All he's got is this flashlight, which basically just illuminates the silt that's been kicked up all around him. But where he is at this exact moment, the silt wasn't too bad. It was just like this abyss all around him. It's totally black. There's nothing around him. And in a sudden panic, Donald thinks, oh my goodness, I'm so far into this cavern, I haven't found Murray, like something's happened to him. He's run out of air or he's gotten lost. Like, how could he have let go of the dive line? What's going on here? And so Donald immediately just starts going down to the bottom of the cave and searching the ground, thinking that, maybe Murray got to this point and passed out and sunk to the bottom, but he gets to the bottom of the cave, there's nothing there, he starts feeling the tunnels, there's nothing, and at this point he's kicked up even more silt, and so, he really can't see anything. And he's thinking, it took me a while to get in here, and I'm running low on oxygen right now. I need to get help immediately, because Murray, he's gonna run out of time really quickly here. And so Donald, he turns around and holding onto this dive line, he pulls himself out of the cavern. He goes back to the surface. Some part of him was hoping that when he got up there that he would just magically see Murray waiting for him, but nope, he's all alone. There's nobody here. And at that point, Donald took off his gear and he contacted authorities. Not long after that, 2 commercial divers, along with an entire US Navy dive team, arrived at Radium Springs and began looking for Murray. And they searched and they searched and they couldn't find him until 8 a.m. the next morning, 12 hours after Donald had surfaced. It would turn out when Donald had that malfunction that caused him to leave the cavern and leave Murray behind and go to the surface and fix himself and then go back down again. Well, in that space of time that he was away from Murray continued to spool out the dive line, maybe not necessarily knowing that Donald had left him at this point, and Murray got all the way to the end of the dive line, 200 feet, and at that point, in this uncharted tunnel he was in, somehow or another, Murray became disconnected from the dive line. Maybe he let go of it, maybe he bumped into something, we don't know, but either way, he let go of the dive line, basically right at the end of the dive line. And when Donald came back down and got to the end of that dive line and discovered Murray wasn't there, well, what he didn't know is that Murray actually was just a couple of feet away. He was basically right above him, because that's where Murray was ultimately found. He had drowned literally feet away from the dive line, but Donald, he couldn't see him, and in a total panic state, in an effort to find Murray, Donald began fumbling around, going down and rubbing up against the bottom and the walls, kicking up all this silt. And you gotta figure at this exact moment, Murray, who's very much alive at this point, almost certainly, is right above him, and now his visibility, which was already terrible, he's probably scared to death because he's looking for this dive line, and now the silt is just getting kicked up all around him. He probably knows Donald's nearby. He's swimming around looking for Donald. Donald's looking for Murray. They swim right past each other. It's absolute madness. But then eventually Donald just vanishes because he's going to find help. And Murray is left all by himself in total darkness, disoriented, terrified, has no idea where the dive line is. Silt is making it impossible to know what direction he's even going. And so in Murray's final moments, he just scrambled around trying to find his way out again until he eventually drowned, again, just feet away from his dive line, the very thing that would have brought him to safety. On May 28, 2022, a photographer named April Vertucci, along with 2 of her friends, snuck towards this abandoned funeral home in Flint, Michigan. The funeral home was a big brick building right off a main road in the center of the city, and April and her 2 friends knew there were lots of people that were kind of looking in this direction, and it was illegal to go into this property, and so very carefully they snuck their way towards the back door of the building, and they saw the door was, completely attached to its hinges. It was in good shape, appeared to be locked, but they thought, what the heck? They walked up to the door, took a look around. April reached down, tried the handle, and it pulled right open. And as soon as this happened, April was psyched, because not only was she a photographer, but she was also an urban explorer, which meant she would sneak into places like this, abandoned buildings and other man-made sites, just to have a look around. One, because it was fun and exciting, but also because she got to use her photography, taking cool pictures of places like this funeral home. And so April's friends were also into urban exploring, and as soon as this door came open, it was like, oh my goodness, I can't believe we're gonna get to explore this legendary site. So this funeral home had been shut down about 5 years earlier because of reports of unsanitary conditions inside. Anonymous reporters had gone in and discovered that there were literally like human remains out. There were up to 40 bodies being stored in one room with no air conditioning, so they're just rotting. There's maggots all over the place. There's embalming liquids on the ground. There's blood everywhere. I mean, basically, this place was like the site of a horror movie. And so the state comes in, they shut this place down, and the owner, after being shut down, just abandons the building, just leaves it exactly the way they had left it. I mean, the bodies were removed by the state, but all the equipment for the funeral home was just left behind. Everything was sealed up, and that was that. And the place was deemed off limits. But naturally, urban explorers found out about this and began going in to see this horror show for themselves. And so April and her friends, they had heard about this place and immediately were like, we gotta go in there. We gotta see it for ourselves. And so they hopped in a car and they drove over 3 hours from Ohio to Michigan just to check this place out. And now here they were, door open, and in they go. Once the door shut behind them, April and her two friends were looking down this long, dark hallway. It's totally silent inside. The walls were made out of cinder block that had been painted white, but the paint was all chipping off and they had their flashlights out and it's dark and creepy and they're looking down the hallway. And just for a second, they just stop and listen to see if anybody else is inside of here moving around. You know, maybe other urban explorers or even other animals or anything, squatters, they don't know. But they're sitting there for a second just listening and they don't hear anything. And so with April in front, they begin walking down this hallway. And as they're walking, there's all this trash on the ground. It's totally eerie as they're walking. You know, every little sound is sort of startling them. They're kind of laughing as they're going. And eventually, April stops in front of this first door that she sees, the first door off the hallway, and it's closed. And right across the center of this door is this big caution sign saying, you know, stay back. And then underneath the caution sign, it says formaldehyde. And so April and her friends knew that, okay, well, formaldehyde is a chemical used to embalm bodies, something funeral homes did. And so they know that behind this door very likely was the embalming room, where funeral homes would literally pump dead bodies full of formaldehyde and prep the bodies, you know, to be presented at the wake, you know, before they're actually laid to rest. You know, it's like this is where actual dead bodies are manipulated. And so April and her friends are pretty excited. And so April's, you know, she opens up the door and they look inside of this room and it's very eerie. It's pretty much vacant. But in the center of this room, it's all dark. They have their flashlights, right? In the center of the room is this metal table, this standalone metal table. It's like a gurney. And it's where the dead body would be placed as they're being embalmed. And then on the walls all around are all these shelves with various tools and, you know, vials of various milky liquids. There's a saw, there's scissors, there's scalpels. On the ground, there's, you know, fabric that appears to have some sort of bodily fluids on it. I mean, this really looks like the scene of a horror movie. But for April and her friends, it's like, this is a gold mine. I mean, this is what we came here for. And so April and her friends, for the next little bit, they just began walking all around the embalming room. You know, April taking photos and her friends and April kind of moving things around, seeing what was in there. And then eventually, you know, they left and they continued to search the building and they found a chapel where there were caskets laying around. They also went into a garage and they found there was an old hearse just left inside the garage. I mean, the place really was as creepy as everybody said it was. And so it was sometime around discovering the garage that the girls had gone back to the main hallway and they discovered this other door that they hadn't seen when they were searching over the first 30 minutes they had been in there. And this door led to this ominous stairwell that went down into what appeared to be the basement. And so at this point, you know, the girls felt like they had sort of searched the entire main floor and, you know, the two friends, not April, they really wanted to go down these steps and explore the basement. You know, they'd been here long enough that it seemed pretty clear that they were the only ones there. It had been totally quiet. And even though it was creepy, I mean, ultimately, they sort of felt safe at this point. And April did too, but she also was having a great time still taking pictures on the first floor. And so at this point, the group decided to split up. The two friends would go down into the basement, and April, for a little bit longer, would stay up on the first floor and just continue taking photos, and then she would join them. And so, no big deal, they split up, the girls go down to the basement, April's taking her photos, doing her thing, and just a couple of minutes later, April hears her friends in the basement, through the floors, yelling out something to the effect of, "Oh my gosh, is that real?" And then the other friend is like, "Yes, that is real, oh my gosh." And so April, she runs to that doorway, she goes down the stairs, and she finds her friends at the foot of the stairs. And they're looking out into the main space of the basement that April can't quite see yet. And so she goes right down to her friends, she's looking at them. They look horrified, they're looking out at something obviously terrible in the basement. And April turns from her friends to the basement, and what she sees makes no sense. There's just like this empty basement, with some stuff pushed up against the walls, but in the middle of the basement is what appears to be like this standalone metal jail cell. Like imagine metal rungs that you would imagine in a jail, but all the way around. It's about 8 feet tall, 10 feet wide, 4 feet deep. It's just this inexplicable standalone jail cell. At least that's the way April interpreted it, and so did her friends. And as she's looking at it, April, she sees that in the middle of the jail cell, if you will, is like this big metal box that's just sitting on the floor in the center of the cell. And then right above it in the ceiling is this pretty big cutout, like a hole in the ceiling. And so April sees this and takes in what she's seeing, and she can't really process it. She doesn't really understand what this is. And she's looking at her friends, and they're so horrified. They've been yelling out about something being real, like, what is that? Oh my gosh. And she's kind of looking back and forth, and then she sees it. She sees there's something else inside of this jail cell. And when she sees it, she recoils in horror. She grabs her friends. They sprint out of the funeral home, and they call the authorities. When authorities arrived, they went right down into the basement and they looked inside of that jail cell, and quickly they determined that April and her friends had not been alone inside of this building like they had thought. It would turn out 6 days earlier, a local man who had nothing to do with April and her friends, totally separate, had gone to this funeral home to have a look around. Except he wasn't an urban explorer. He was not going in here to have a good time or take photos. He was going inside to steal scrap metal and try to sell it for a profit. And so he made his way inside the funeral home, he looked around, he didn't really find much, but eventually went down into the basement. And when he got down there, he turned, he looked out at that space down there, and he saw this jail cell, this metal jail cell that just kind of sat in the middle of the basement. Except what he would have seen is just the bars that sort of surrounded the outside of the cell, the actual cell itself. The metal box in the middle that was on the floor that April saw and her friend saw, that was not there. And the hole in the ceiling would not have been there. He would have just seen basically a lot of metal in the middle of the basement. So he's thinking, I've hit the jackpot. This is exactly what I've come here for, to take this metal and go sell it. And so this man, he goes into the jail cell, into this cage, and he quickly realizes the actual metal struts that made up the cage, even if they were super valuable, they were thick and difficult to cut through, and so realistically, they were going to be really hard to extricate and get out of this place. But when the man is actually inside of this jail cell, this cage, he sees there's actually some other metal that he hadn't seen when he first came down that might be far easier to extract. Basically, right in the middle of this cell were additional metal rods that were running from the ceiling down to the ground. They were far thinner and easier to move around. And he's thinking, I could actually cut these and get these out of here and turn a profit on them, and then come back at a later date with, more people or more powerful tools to cut the metal that sort of was the cage, the stuff that he had originally seen. And so, feeling pretty optimistic, the guy put his stuff down, his phone, his wallet, his other things off to the side, in the cage. And then he got out his bolt cutters and he cut the very first one of these thinner cables right in the middle of the cell. And as soon as he cut one of them, there was this loud rumbling sound he would have heard right above him. And then this big metal box came crashing down and pinned him to the ground. It would turn out what this man had walked inside of was not a jail cell in the basement of the funeral home. It was actually the inner workings of something known as a casket lift. Basically, the funeral home has to raise caskets from the basement where potentially they're stored up to the main floor to be used. And, they're pretty cumbersome, big things that need to get moved around. And so effectively, they have an elevator that brings them up. And so that big metal box that came crashing down on this guy was the actual lift itself that actually carried up the caskets. And the cord that he cut were actually the cords that supported that lift. And so as soon as he cut one of them, he was cutting the support to effectively the elevator car that was right above him that then fell and crushed him. However, he didn't die from getting crushed. He just got trapped. And as soon as he realized he was trapped and being kind of crushed to death here, he reached for his phone, but he realized his phone was just barely outside of his reach. He couldn't get to his phone. And nobody knew he was here. This was an illegal activity. He didn't broadcast where he was going. And so he's stuck. He can't call anyone, and no one knows he's here. And so for 6 days, that lift gradually crushed this man to death. And then finally, when April and her friends showed up and they went down in the basement, they didn't just see, this destroyed casket lift. They saw this dead man's body, and he was literally outstretched, still reaching for his phone. On the morning of September 10th, 1987, Police Constable Dick Ellis walked into an interview room in a police station in South Yorkshire, England. Inside of this room was a table, and sitting on the other side of this table were these 2 security guards. One was named Stephen Brooks, and the other was named David Goldthorpe. And from PC Ellis's perspective, his first impression of these 2 guys is they were like big, burly, tough-looking men. He could tell they were both visibly shaken, like something had really rattled both of these guys. However, before Ellis could even sit down and begin asking basic questions about what was going on here, these 2 security guards just launched into this totally crazy-sounding story. The men told Ellis that the night before, they had been patrolling this construction site where workers were building a 6-mile stretch of highway and bridge that were called the Stocks Bridge Bypass. Now, at this time of night, there was nobody at the site, no workers, nothing like that. And so really it was the security guard's job to make sure nobody entered the site and either tampered with equipment or tried to steal anything. Now, the night had been very routine and quiet until around midnight. It was at that point that David and Stephen, these 2 security guards, had reached the bridge, the half-constructed bridge portion of this bypass. And as they're walking along the highway and they see the bridge out in front of them, they stopped because they saw clearly there was a figure standing on this bridge. It almost looked like a man who was wearing a long jacket, like a cloak or something, and he appeared to be staring down below the bridge, down towards the valley, underneath what the bridge was actually going over. Like this man clearly had not spotted these security guards. And so naturally, they began calling out to this guy, asking him like, hey, what are you doing here? What's going on? This is a private construction site, like you need to go. But the guy on the bridge didn't react. He just kept staring down to the valley below. And so at that point, as the 2 security guards are now walking in the direction of this guy, one of them lifts up his flashlight and shines it at this man. And when he does, the beam of light appears to just go through this man's body, like his body isn't solid, and the light just passed right through. And as soon as they did that, both Stephen and David just stopped, shocked at what they're seeing, aiming this light at this guy. And as they're doing this, the figure appeared to kind of turn and look at David and Stephen. And they were so unsettled and terrified by it that instead of protecting the construction site, they just turned and ran. And they went to the police. Now, after PC Ellis had been told this story, he did not believe in any way that what they had experienced was supernatural. He's thinking, okay, clearly, you saw some guy and, maybe he shouldn't have been there and maybe it was a trick of the light or something, or maybe that wasn't a person at all and you just thought it was. Like, who knows? But there has to be a logical, rational explanation here. And so feeling kind of annoyed that he was called in to deal with this, Ellis looks at these 2 guys and he's like, look, this is not a police matter. Why don't you guys, if you're so shaken up by this, go talk to the church or something. Like, this is not something we can help you with. And at that, the 2 security guards just said, okay, and they got up and they left. And Ellis, truthfully, didn't think about this at all. It was like, okay, great, that's done. I don't got to deal with that. And he went on with his day. But later that day, Ellis got a call from his boss being like, hey, did you tell 2 security guards who came in here to go talk to the church about some ghosts they saw at a construction site or something? And at this, Ellis had to kind of explain what had happened and how he had sort of flippantly told them to, go see the church if they really thought they saw a ghost. But his boss was like, well, they took you literally, and they are currently at the local church, those two security guards right now, and they are refusing to leave unless the church helps them with this ghost situation. And so Ellis's boss told him that you just need to go to the church, get these two guys to calm down, and leave. Go do that right now. And so Ellis is like, I can't believe they took that seriously. Okay, fine. So he hops in his cruiser, he goes to the church, he finds these two guys who are still totally shaken up, and they're pleading with people to take them seriously. Somebody needs to go out there and see what's on the bridge, see what this could have been. And Ellis is like, guys, I will tonight go to the bridge, I will check it out, I'll see what's going on there if you leave the church and you don't come back. Like, leave these people alone. And at this, David and Stephen, they're totally relieved. They're like, oh, you will? Oh my gosh, great. We'll leave. Thank you. Like, let us know what you find. And they left the church. And so they left, and PC Ellis is like, okay, great. I guess tonight I'm going to go looking for ghosts. And so that night, around midnight, PC Ellis and his partner drove over to the construction site. Specifically, they went to the bridge. They got on the road that actually went underneath this unfinished bridge, and they camped out on this lower road. Looking straight up in front of them was this bridge. They're basically just going to monitor this bridge because that's where the security guards claim to have seen this figure, this ghost. They're going to stake out this bridge, see what happens, call it good. Now, at first, nothing happened on this bridge. Ellis and his partner just sat there staring bored up at this bridge, waiting for, the time to pass by so they could leave. But at some point, Ellis noticed movement up on the bridge, and so did his partner. Now, they couldn't quite tell what it was, and they couldn't even see if it was still moving around anymore, but clearly something had moved on the bridge. And so for a couple of seconds, Ellis and his partner are just staring really intently up at the bridge, waiting to see something else happen, but, nothing else did. And so Ellis is like, well, I got to go up there and check because, maybe there is some guy who's trespassing on the construction site, and that's what the security guard saw. Like, I got to go up there and see, because from down here, we really can't see too well. And so Ellis told his partner to just stay put in the car, that he, Ellis, would go up on the bridge and have a look around. And so Ellis, he got out of the car, all he had was a flashlight, and he began walking over to the bottom of this bridge. And there was actually a ladder he would have to climb up to the actual bridge, because remember, they're on the road below this bridge. And so Ellis, he gets to the ladder, he begins climbing up the ladder, and as he's going up, he's kind of staring up, almost expecting somebody to poke their head over, but, it's quiet, no one's looking over the edge. And eventually, Ellis gets to the top, and he climbs onto the bridge, and again, it's this unfinished bridge, there's no traffic up here, and he looks roughly in the direction of where he thought he saw movement when he was down in the car looking up here, which also happened to be roughly the area where the two security guards had described seeing the figure that their light had shone through. And sure enough, Ellis looks and he sees there's this cloaked figure standing a little ways off of the side of the bridge, apparently just looking down towards his police car. And Ellis, at first, he's kind of shocked. He can't believe that, there's some legitimacy to the story these guys had told, and he couldn't help but be kind of frightened for a second. But then Ellis raised his flashlight and shined it at this figure, and as soon as he did, he just laughed. Because all it was a plastic tarp wrapped around some construction equipment. That's what the security guards clearly had seen. And, when they shine their light, it's a clear plastic tarp here. The light could theoretically go through it. You can kind of see how they would think, oh my gosh, it's a ghost. And so Ellis is like, this is all this was. This was nothing. I knew it was nothing, and now I know it's nothing. And so after doing a cursory walk around the bridge to, make sure nobody was up there, and, he looked around, there wasn't anybody there, Ellis went back to the ladder, climbed back down, got in the car with his partner, and explained to him that this whole thing was a joke. And of course, there's no ghost, there's no criminals, there's nothing. This is no big deal. Now, Ellis and his partner could have, at this point, just left and gone home, but they had told their boss they'd come out here for at least an hour, and, they'd only been here for maybe 30 minutes at this point. And so the two of them decided, you know what, just because we said we would, let's just stay here a little bit longer and make sure nobody goes on this bridge. We'll give it another, 30 minutes or so. And so Ellis and his partner just kind of sit back in their seats and settle in for this last little stretch of their shift. However, about 20 minutes into this final 30 minutes, Ellis is still just sitting there, his window's open, and he's just kind of doing nothing, waiting around. when suddenly he's hit with this unbelievably cold gust of air that comes into the car through his window. And it's kind of like sudden, like he's being hit with this gust of cold air. And then at the same time, Ellis began feeling this incredible pressure on his chest. Like it was so intense, he thought he was having a heart attack. And he wanted to say something to his partner, but it was like he couldn't even move. He's like frozen. He's getting scared. He doesn't know what's happening. And as much as he wanted to like yell out and get his partner's attention to help him, he suddenly had this overwhelming feeling that there was someone off to the side staring at him, someone right outside the car. And even though he didn't want to look, he found himself slowly turning and looking out his open window. And right there, immediately outside the door, is this man standing practically pressed up against the window. His torso is inches away from Ellis's face, just standing there inexplicably. Like this guy snuck up on them. They didn't even hear him. And so Ellis, at this point, he breaks out of his sort of trance. He screams and gets his partner's attention. And then he pushes open his door and he jumps out to confront this person who snuck up on them. But there's no one outside the car. And so Ellis, he turns to his partner and he's like, "Hey, did you just see what I just saw? Did you see that guy?" And Ellis's partner, who's totally ashen-faced, just looks at Ellis and he's like, "Yeah, I did see him." And so after looking around for a couple more seconds, Ellis climbed back into the car and then he and his partner debriefed what had just happened. And Ellis's partner would tell Ellis that from his seat, he actually had a better vantage point than Ellis did to seeing this guy. I mean, Ellis was basically right on top of this guy, but his partner was a little bit farther back and had a better angle. And he would tell Ellis that at some point he had turned and seen the guy standing there. And the guy, he was wearing this old coat, this long coat that sort of looked like it belonged in the 1800s or something. And the partner would say, like, he didn't hear this guy approach. He didn't know how he got there. But at some point, he said the guy in the coat, the guy outside, crouched down just enough that he was looking in the car in the direction of Ellis's partner. And Ellis's partner said he was staring right at the guy, but the guy, he had no face. Ultimately, Ellis and his partner would return to the station that night and they would file a report about what happened to them. But they would simply describe it as inexplicable phenomenon, and after filing it, they basically hoped they would never have to talk about it again. Except that wouldn't be possible, because shortly after filing that report, the construction was finished, and so the highway and the bridge were open to the public. And pretty much right away, people started dying on that bridge. Like a crazy high number of people just inexplicably would get in these fatal accidents on the bridge. And this bridge was not like especially hazardous. It was a beautiful brand new bridge. I mean, there really should not have been this many accidents. But it was not just that so many people were dying on this bridge inexplicably. No, also in tandem with all the fatal accidents were all the independently reported sightings of this dark figure standing on the bridge that had no face. So the leading theory amongst people who believe what's happening at this bridge is basically paranormal is that the construction of this bridge and the highway disturbed a gravesite, and that has led to all the tragedy and death that has followed. But they've never actually been able to prove if there really was a gravesite where this bridge or the highway was built. The two security guards, Stephen Brooks and David Goldthorpe, both quit their jobs. As for Ellis and his partner, they've never changed their stories, and they also have never found a reasonable explanation for what they saw. On the night of January 3rd, 2008, a 21-year-old man named Part Engel had just poured himself a beer and sat down on the couch next to his girlfriend to watch some TV when he heard a knock at the front door of his apartment in Pottstown, Pennsylvania. It was late, around 8 p.m., and Part was not expecting any company, and so before he got up, he looked over at his girlfriend to be like, "Are you expecting anybody?" And she looked at him and kind of shrugged, and so Part just put his beer down and stood up and walked over to the front door to see who was there. And when Part opened up the front door, he was very surprised to see his mother standing there carrying a small duffel bag. So Part's mother lived in Middletown Township, which was located about an hour and a half away from Part's apartment, and while it was not unusual for Part's mom to stay over at Part's apartment, what was unusual is her just showing up unannounced. She never did that. And on top of that, as Part is looking at his mom, he could see clearly she had been crying because her eyeliner was smudged and her face was all puffy. And so Part knew clearly, there must be a problem here. But when he asked his mother, like, what's going on, Mom? She wouldn't tell him. She would just say, I have to stay with you for the night. And then before he or Part's girlfriend could do or say anything, his mom just walked inside, walked down the hallway, went into the guest bedroom, and then shut and locked the door. And so Part and his girlfriend were left looking at each other like, what's going on here? 3 hours later, at 11 p.m., Part was in bed next to his sleeping girlfriend, just staring up at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Part was so anxious about whatever was going on with his mom because where he was staying, his bedroom, was right next door to the guest bedroom where his mom was staying, and so he already knows there's clearly some issue here with his mom, but all night he's been listening to her next door just pacing and crying in this guest bedroom, and he has no idea what's going on. But deep down, Part knew that whatever was going on, it very likely had to do with his father, whose name was Arun Kumar. Part's parents had a complicated relationship. They had immigrated from India decades earlier and had settled in Pennsylvania, where they had 2 kids, Part and Part's sister. Part's father, Arun Kumar, worked as an engineer at Boeing, and Part's mother owned a 7-Eleven franchise. And basically, since arriving in America, the 2 of them had really come with nothing and had worked their way up to now to where they had a very comfortable life, kind of like the American dream, the house, the white picket fence, the kids, the whole thing. And so Part had always believed that, his parents, as a result of getting through so much hardship together, that they must truly love each other now. I mean, to have gone through all that together, that would certainly make 2 people very close. And for the most part, that actually seemed to have been the case, that his parents just got along great and were a great couple. That is until a couple of years earlier. Arun Kumar had started an affair, and Part's mother had caught him. Now, Arun Kumar said that, this affair meant nothing and he would stop right now, and Part's mother had forgiven him, in order to keep the family together. But despite Part's mom forgiving Arun Kumar, deep down, she just knew she could never actually trust him again. And so she actually wound up enlisting Part's help to basically watch Arun Kumar's behavior. She had Part set up the software that basically spied on Arun Kumar's computer. Through this software, Part's mom could basically watch Arun Kumar's email traffic and all of his internet activity. Now, Part had not felt good about setting up the spy software on his dad's computer. It just felt totally wrong to be getting in between his parents like this. But he just felt like this was the only way Part's mom was ever going to be able to actually move on. And so Part sort of felt like this was his responsibility. This is the way that the family was going to stay together. His mom really just needed that extra layer of transparency on her husband. Otherwise, the family was going to fall apart. But now, as Part lay in his bed, unable to sleep, listening to his mom pace back and forth in the room next door, he began to think to himself, maybe my mom found something using the software on my dad's computer. Maybe Arun Kumar had started another affair, and that was why his mom was now so upset. But just then, Part heard a new noise coming out of his mother's room. At first, it kind of sounded like low murmuring, like his mom was saying something to herself, but then he realized his mom was having a real conversation with somebody on the phone. And since Part couldn't sleep, and he was pretty intrigued about what the heck was going on with his mom to begin with, he decided to basically spy on his mom. So he very quietly got out of his bed, and he walked around to the wall that lined up against his mother's room, and he put his ear to the wall, and he began to listen. And what he heard was far worse than anything he could have imagined. What he heard his mom saying to whoever she was talking on the phone was that she had discovered that Arun Kumar had taken out $3.6 million in life insurance policies on Part, on his sister, and on his mother. And now Part's mom was saying to whoever she was talking to on the phone that she wasn't even worried about divorce at this point. She was worried about the physical safety of her and her kids. She was worried that her husband was going to kill her and her kids to get this payout. And so not long after saying this, Part's mom hung up the phone and went back to pacing and crying in the room. And Part, meanwhile, has just heard this horrifying news, and he had no idea what to make of it. I mean, he knew his dad was not a good husband, but the idea that his dad would want to hurt his wife or him or his sister just seemed totally impossible. But then, as Part's standing there just kind of processing what he's heard, he began to think back to these recent behavioral changes he noticed in his father that at the time he had kind of chalked up to, maybe my dad's stressed or something. But now, given the context of what his mom was talking about, Part began to wonder if these behavioral changes were a sign of something being terribly wrong with his father. The first change that Part had noticed happened a few weeks earlier. Now, Part's dad was normally a very mild-mannered and calm guy, but a few weeks earlier, he had gotten into this vicious dispute with their next-door neighbor over the property line that ran between their two properties. It was like he was picking a fight with the neighbor or something. And then, a few days after that, one of the bathroom sinks in their house had stopped working, and so Arun Kumar got out his tools and went to go break apart the sink and put it back together again, and because he was an engineer, this was something he did. This was typical behavior. But after breaking apart the sink, basically ripping it all apart and having all the parts on the ground, Part's dad didn't put it back together. He just left all the tools and all the parts just scattered across the bathroom floor. And considering that Arun Kumar was typically incredibly meticulous and organized, and he's this brilliant engineer, to Part, seeing his dad leave this sloppy mess and this unfinished sink, it felt totally off. And so standing there in his bedroom, totally horrified about everything he's heard, and, now kind of second-guessing everything he knew about his dad, who suddenly seemed like this combative, kind of disorganized guy, Part suddenly felt like, I have to learn more here. I have to figure out if my dad really is a threat. So Part quietly left his bedroom and made his way to the kitchen where his laptop was, and he loaded up that software that spied on his dad's computer. And as he began logging into this program, Part was thinking, maybe I'm going to find something that will show that my mom is clearly just overreacting and misinterpreting what she's seeing, that, my dad is not, out to kill us for some insurance payout. But after loading up this program and kind of scanning through some recent activity, Part realized that actually the situation with his dad was way worse than his mom had made out on that call he overheard. He not only found all these multi-million-dollar insurance policies taken out on him, his sister, and his mom, but also he discovered this stash of fraudulent-looking paperwork. There were all these passport photos of his father, but then connected to these photos was a passport application that was using somebody else's name, as if his father was trying to forge paperwork to create a phony passport for himself. And so at this point, Part felt like his mother was certainly not overreacting here, that in fact it really did seem like his father was, preparing to kill his family and collect millions of dollars in insurance money, and then using this, fake passport he was making, he'd be able to flee the country. For the next several days, Part's mom stayed at Part's apartment, but she barely ever left the guest bedroom. And then when she would leave the bedroom, Part would go up to her and try to ask her, hey, what's going on, without giving away how much he knew already. But Part's mom was like, nope, I don't want to talk about it, and she would just go right back in the room, shut and lock the door. And so finally, after several days of this, Part just went to his mom's bedroom door, he knocked on the door until she answered, and then before she could kind of shoo him away, he said, Mom, stop, I know what's going on, I read the emails, and we have to figure out what we're going to do, because our lives literally depend on it. I agree with you, it looks like Dad is going to kill us and then flee the country. And so Part and his mom would talk through all the details of what was found on his computer, and ultimately they would decide that Part would be the one to go to police and tell them what was going on with Arun Kumar. And so the next day, Part went to the police station, with a stack of evidence that he believed would implicate his father, and Part was so nervous about this, he was shaking. But when he talked to an actual police officer, they looked over his evidence and they heard the whole story, but they told him, look, we really can't do anything about this. They told Part that, it's not illegal to take out life insurance policies on your family. And then also the police officer pointed out that in addition to Arun Kumar taking out those policies on his kids and his wife, he had also taken out a policy on himself and made his wife and his kids the beneficiaries of that policy. And so the police officer said, look, this does not look like a murder plot to me. It just looks like your dad is doing something fairly responsible. And then as for the passport application paperwork where his dad had used a phony name, the police officer said, look, he has not filed this paperwork, and so it's not illegal what he's doing. Anybody can get some paperwork out and fill it in with whatever they want. It becomes illegal if they attempt to actually pass it off and submit the paperwork, and as far as we know, he hasn't done that. So that's weird, but it's not illegal. And so Part had to leave the police station, and he went back to the apartment, and he told his mom what happened, and ultimately they decided that all they could do now was just wait and continue to watch that software that monitored Arun Kumar's computer, and just hope Arun Kumar would do something that was incriminating that they could then bring to the police and say, see, he's trying to kill us and collect a payout and flee the country. Over the next few days, that Part and his mother every day just constantly checked this software and watched what Arun Kumar was doing on his computer, all they saw was Arun Kumar was using his computer to do work emails and really basic stuff, absolutely nothing incriminating. And in fact, over these few days, Arun Kumar would actually call Part's mom to ask her when she was coming back home again, and she would tell him that basically she was going to stay at Part's place indefinitely, and Arun Kumar did not seem upset or annoyed by this at all. If anything, it just seemed like he was really distracted and wasn't actually listening to Part's mom as she was speaking. And while this did seem kind of suspicious to Part and his mom, that basically Arun Kumar didn't care that his wife wasn't coming home anytime soon, it still wasn't incriminating. And so, Part and his mom decided to just continue looking deeper and deeper into Arun Kumar's computer to see if there was anything that could begin to explain what was really going on here. And sure enough, Part dug deeper and deeper into Arun Kumar's computer, and he did discover something. Part began finding all these emails with people back in India that kind of vaguely indicated that Arun Kumar was involved in a very sketchy deal, like a business deal. Now, again, the emails were incredibly vague, but what was clear in these back and forths in these emails was that it seemed like Arun Kumar had gotten wrapped up with some really shady people, and they were having these really nasty exchanges in these emails about this, deal that Arun Kumar seemed to be involved in. And so Part began to wonder if maybe he and his mom had this all backwards, that he, his mom, and his sister were not the ones actually in danger here, that in fact it was Arun Kumar who was in danger. Maybe because this deal, went south, and these people that he was doing this deal with, maybe they were mad at him, and so perhaps all these life insurance policies and this new fake identity were some sort of move by Arun Kumar to kind of flee the danger he was in. And so obviously, if this was true, this was still a horrible situation for their whole family, but it was markedly better than what Part and his mom had been operating on before, which was, that Arun Kumar was going to kill his whole family. And so pretty quickly, as a result of kind of thinking about this in a new way, Part's mother started feeling a lot better about the whole situation and actually left Part's apartment and went back to the house to go live with Arun Kumar. And Part himself began to think that, maybe this is not as big of a deal as we thought it was. I'm sure my dad will figure out whatever he needs to figure out here to get out of whatever mess he's in. And over the coming days, Part checked in with his mom every single day because now she's living with Arun Kumar, and she said everything was fine. And Part, he continued to check his dad's computer activity, and nothing else really popped up. It was still just the same stuff they had originally found. And so it just kind of seemed like, maybe this really is not as big of a deal as we thought it was. But on the morning of January 20th, 2008, so about 2.5 weeks after Part's mom showed up at his apartment, everything changed. On that morning, Part logged into his computer to check on his dad's computer using that software, because he was still checking it every single day, and the first thing he saw was his dad had sent this email to this woman who Part didn't know, and this woman was certainly not his mother, and in this email, his dad told this person that he had a big contract coming up, and he was going to make a ton of money from it, and then also at the end of this email, he told this woman that he loved her. And so right away, Part's thinking, okay, my dad is obviously having another affair because this is not my mom and he's saying he loves her. And also, what's my dad talking about with this big contract coming up? Is he talking about the insurance policies? Does he expect those to pay out soon, indicating that I, my sister, or my mom might be dead? And then also, the other thing that Part noticed that morning as he's checking through his dad's computer activity is he found another message his dad had sent out recently where he communicated to somebody that his father had died. So Part's grandfather had died. And also in this message, Arun Kumar is telling this person that he's going to go to his dad's funeral alone, that his wife and 2 kids were not invited to this funeral. And so Part's reading this, and he's totally devastated by the fact that his grandfather's dead, and the fact that, he's not being invited to the funeral? But again, he's thinking, oh my gosh, is that because my dad thinks I'm not going to be alive? Is this all connected, between the big contract and the fact that we're not going to be at the funeral? Is this my dad thinking he's going to enact this murder plot soon? Part didn't know, but he felt like he and his mom and his sister were running out of time and he needed to act right now. And so Part got off his computer, he called his mom, and they made a plan. That evening at around 9:15 p.m., Part got in his car and began driving towards his parents' house to go confront his dad. This was the plan he and his mom had come up with. Basically, his mom would stay at Part's apartment, and Part would go and tell his dad, we know about what you're doing, and you gotta stop. And even though Part was totally jacked up on adrenaline as he drove towards the house, he felt like he really had the upper hand going into whatever this confrontation was going to be. Because, number one, Part was showing up totally unannounced at night to his dad's place. His dad's going to be caught off guard when he sees him. And also, Part knew he was much physically bigger than his father. Part was over 6 feet tall and over 200 pounds, and so he had the physical angle as well.
And so Part really felt confident driving towards the house that he was going to come out the victor in whatever ensued. At around 10:45 p.m., Part finally arrived in front of his parents' house. He parked the car, he got out, he walked up the front steps, and he knocked on the front door. And a couple of seconds later, Arun Kumar came to the door, he opened it up, and he's totally confused to see his son standing there. And then before Arun Kumar could do anything, Part, in his deepest and most authoritative voice, looked at his dad and said, "We need to talk." And then he intentionally bumped into his dad with his shoulder as he walked into the house. And so his dad is like standing at the front door, not really sure what's going on. And Part, after taking a few steps in, he abruptly turns around. And so now he's looking back at his dad. And he takes a step forward and gets right in his dad's face and says, "I know what you're up to. I know what you've done. And you have a simple choice to make. You can either stop what you're doing and become the family man you're supposed to be, faithful to mom, or I'm going to go to the police and tell them what you're up to, and you're going to go to jail. Either way, whatever you're doing stops right now." And for a moment, Part and Arun Kumar are basically staring at each other in silence. And then Arun Kumar, before Part could stop him, basically ran past Part, passed him down the hallway, and he ran into the master bedroom, disappearing from Part's view. And so Part's turned around, and he wasn't expecting this. And suddenly, all that confidence he had going into this confrontation was gone. Because he's thinking, oh my goodness, my dad, maybe he's got a weapon in there. I need to get in there and stop him. And so Part, he turns and runs down the hallway. He darts into the bedroom, having no idea what he's going to see inside, but what he sees does catch him off guard. Arun Kumar is just sitting on the bed, doing nothing. He's just staring what looks like at the wall, and Part just stops in the doorway, looks at his dad, and then realizes his dad's not just absently staring at the wall, he's staring into the open bathroom. And in the open bathroom, on the ground, are all those tools left over from where his dad had been working on the sink and then never finished. Like, all these tools are scattered on the ground, including one tool that now Part is realizing his dad is looking directly at. It was a big, heavy metal pipe wrench. And suddenly Part realized, my dad is looking at a weapon, and he's considering whether or not to get that weapon and attack me with it. The next morning, Part's mother pulled up in front of the house that she shared with Arun Kumar. And she walked up the steps, went to the front door, she opened it up, and as soon as she stepped inside, she yelled out, "Hello, who's here?" But there was silence. And immediately she got a bad feeling. But she knew she had to investigate. And so Part's mom began slowly walking down the hallway, the same hallway that Part and his dad had been fighting in the night before. And she went down the hallway, and she turned and looked into the master bedroom, and she couldn't believe what she saw. There was blood on the carpets, on the walls. It was a bloodbath, and in the middle of the room was an obvious dead body that was so mutilated and destroyed, she couldn't even identify it. And so seconds later, she had run outside and dialed 911. It would take police almost 4 years to finally untangle Arun Kumar's insane web of lies and also make an arrest for the murder that took place inside of that house. And the reason it took nearly 4 years is because nothing in this case was what it looked like. Now, Part and his mother had been correct about a number of things about Arun Kumar. For example, Arun Kumar was having another affair, he had taken out life insurance policies on his whole family, and he was looking to obtain a fake identity. They were also right that Arun Kumar had become embroiled in a very shady deal back in India, but the specifics of that deal were not what Part and Part's mom thought it was. And when Arun Kumar announced in that message that, his father had died and he'd be traveling to India all alone, that his wife and his kids weren't coming, they weren't invited, well, Part and his mom had been correct, that this was a cover, this was an excuse for Arun Kumar to put his big plan into action. And Arun Kumar's big plan did involve murder, and so Part and his mom were right about that aspect of his plan. However, Arun Kumar's target for this murder was not who Part and his mom thought it was. They were not the target. Arun Kumar was going to murder himself. Or more specifically, he was going to pretend to kill himself. That was actually the shady deal he was involved in back in India. He was working with people who could help him fake his own death. And so what he was going to do is go to India, fake his death, and then once he was dead on paper, that would trigger an insurance payout of his own life insurance policy, and that money would go to his wife and his kids, and then Arun Kumar would disappear using his fake identity he would have, along with his mistress, the woman he was having an affair with. That was the person he had sent that email to talking about the big payout. But Part and Part's mom did not know this last critical piece of Arun Kumar's plan. They really believed they were the target of this big plot, that they were going to get killed. And so that's why they felt like they had to act first. So on January 20th, 2008, Part and his mother worked out an alibi for themselves. What they were going to tell people is that at around 8 p.m., Part went and picked up his mother from the house that she shared with Arun Kumar, and the two of them just went back to Part's apartment, and that was it. But in reality, Part never went over and picked his mom up and brought her back to the apartment. Instead, she was at the house with Arun Kumar when Part showed up at 10:45 p.m. to confront Arun Kumar. So it was him and his mom at the house as Part is demanding Arun Kumar come clean and stop what he's doing. And then at some point during this heated argument in the hallway, Arun Kumar turned and ran into the bedroom, and Part chased after him. And Part, he sees Arun Kumar sitting on the edge of the bed, and he thinks his dad is looking at the pipe wrench on the floor in the bathroom. And Part thinks, my dad is about to get that wrench and attack me with it. And so Part just acted first, and he ran and grabbed that wrench, and he beat his father to death with it. And then after leaving his father's unrecognizable, mutilated body just lumped in the middle of the bedroom floor, blood all over the walls, he and his mother just left the house and went back to Part's apartment. And then the next day, Part's mom went back to the house, and she pretended to find Arun Kumar's body, even though she already knew he was in there. And then she called 911 and acted totally beside herself when they showed up, as if she had just happened upon her husband's dead body. But almost 4 years later, when the truth finally came out about this horrible situation, Part and his mother were arrested. Now, both of them absolutely maintained that they genuinely believed their lives were in danger because of Arun Kumar, and they said during that confrontation in the house, Part was only acting in self-defense. He really believed his dad was going to grab that pipe wrench first, and so he had to do it before him, and that's why he killed his dad. But ultimately, Part would plead guilty to manslaughter, and he would be sentenced to 33 months in prison, and Part's mother would plead guilty to conspiracy, and she would be sentenced to 10 months in prison.
City lights cut through the night. A distant whistle calls the line. One door opens, time stands still. Only a heartbeat left to ride. Still tracks lead beyond the skyline. Winds carry dreams still undefined. Burdens never die. They are little Gucci's. He'll have his halo in the sky. The Satsuki upper fits them all. Family and friends will bury him. My little champion, better Jordan, will cover him with the colors of the East. As she tackles truly the best of mankind, dreaming in the bamboo grove, trampling on water. Dies, the saying in hard bright sky, I can't stop half night. And there when the night tries, I never sing sigh. And is there vibration now, and not cheering above the star? Will happy to my home. You love my fears. Look at we choose a call. A common staff, we read and stuff, and we didn't.
I want the people in the audience